The first scream didn't come from the gunshot. It came a second later, when people realized what those sounds actually were. A moment earlier, the hall had been filled with quiet conversation, hugs, and the heavy silence that follows a young life cut short. More than 100 people had gathered on a cold February evening in Birmingham, standing together in grief, remembering a 17-year-old boy who should still have been alive. Then 4 shots cracked through the air. In an instant, mourning turned into chaos. Chairs scraped across the floor. People dove for cover. Some ran blindly toward the exits while others froze, trying to understand how a funeral wake had suddenly become a shooting scene. Outside, a stolen car was already speeding away into the dark. The man in the back seat hadn't come to pay his respects. He hadn't come to grieve. He had come with a gun, a plan, and one goal: find members of a rival gang and open fire, even if it meant spraying bullets into a crowd of mourners. What happened that night would expose something far bigger than one attack. It revealed a city caught in a relentless gang war, where even a child's funeral wasn't off limits. The sound of gunfire shattered the quiet evening outside St Mary's Church Hall on Hampstead Road. Just moments earlier, the atmosphere had been solemn but peaceful. Around 100 people had gathered inside the hall in Handsworth, Birmingham, sharing memories, comforting one another, and saying goodbye to a 17-year-old boy whose life had ended far too soon. Then, in a matter of seconds, grief turned into chaos. 4 shots rang out from a passing car. Panic spread instantly. People screamed, ran for the exits, and dove behind cars and walls trying to escape the bullets cutting through the air. What should have been a place of mourning suddenly became a scene of pure terror. Inside that vehicle was a 21-year-old man named Meshach Bryman. He hadn't come to mourn the boy whose wake had brought everyone together that evening. He had come for a completely different reason. In the violent world he lived in, a world shaped by gang rivalries and street wars, this gathering wasn't a memorial, it was an opportunity. Bryman believed members of a rival gang would be there, and in the brutal logic of Birmingham's ongoing gang conflicts, that was enough. What happened that night wasn't random violence. It was the result of a feud that had been growing for years between 2 of the city's most dangerous groups, gangs whose rivalry had already left multiple victims behind, and whose hatred was fueled not only on the streets, but also online. To understand how a funeral became a target, you first have to understand the gangs at the center of this conflict. One of them was a group known as Armed Response. The gang had roots stretching back to the early 2000s in North Birmingham neighborhoods like Handsworth and Lozells. These areas had long struggled with poverty, overcrowded housing, and limited opportunities for young people. Over time, criminal groups began to grow within those communities, drawing in teenagers who felt trapped in an environment where violence and drug dealing seemed like the only path available. Armed Response became one of the most visible of those groups. But unlike older gangs that tried to stay hidden, this generation embraced visibility. They built their identity around drill music, a genre known for its aggressive lyrics and its connection to street life. Members filmed music videos in their neighborhoods, flashing signs, mocking their rivals, and sometimes even naming enemies directly in their lyrics. The videos didn't stay local. They were uploaded to YouTube and spread across social media, where thousands of viewers watched them. For the gang members themselves, the internet became an extension of the street. Threats were delivered through lyrics, insults appeared in comment sections, rival gangs responded with their own videos. The conflict never really stopped, it simply moved between the real world and the digital one. Police began noticing just how dangerous this culture was becoming. In 2016, West Midlands Police arrested a 20-year-old man connected to Armed Response, who had been broadcasting the gang's activities online. In his videos, he openly glorified shootings and taunted rival groups. One recording showed him describing violent attacks in detail, almost as if they were trophies. The man, known by the rap name Lynch, was eventually sentenced to 27 years in prison. Investigators linked him to a series of shootings across Birmingham that left 8 people wounded. One of the victims was a 16-year-old boy who had been shot in the back outside a barbecue party. Even after Lynch went to prison, the videos remained online. They continued to circulate on social media, watched by younger members who were growing up in the same neighborhoods and absorbing the same messages. Instead of slowing down the violence, the culture around these gangs only became more extreme. And by the early 2020s, the next generation was already proving even more reckless. In November 2021, 4 members of Armed Response targeted a 13-year-old boy in an attack that shocked even experienced police officers. The boy had simply walked into an area the gang believed belonged to them. CCTV footage later showed what happened next. A stolen car screeched to a stop near him at Hawkley Circus. Several men jumped out and chased the terrified teenager through an underpass. One of them carried a homemade weapon known as a slam gun, essentially 2 pieces of metal pipe welded together to fire a shotgun cartridge. Crude, unstable, and extremely dangerous. One of the attackers fired the weapon. The blast struck the boy in the spine. Miraculously, he survived, but the damage was devastating. The bullet left him permanently paralyzed. He was only 13 years old. What made the case even more disturbing was what happened afterward. One of the men involved later appeared in a drill music video, where he expressed frustration, not because he had shot a child, but because the child had survived. That man would later receive a life sentence. By that point, the reputation of Armed Response was already firmly established in Birmingham. Their willingness to carry out violence in public spaces, and then boast about it online, had made them both feared and notorious. But they weren't the only group operating in the area. Another gang, known as 9 Boys, occupied much of the same territory across North Birmingham, particularly around Lascelles, Aston, and surrounding neighbourhoods. Like Armed Response, they were heavily involved in drug distribution. They controlled local runners, moved narcotics through the streets, and projected their identity through drill music videos that mirrored the style of their rivals. They filmed themselves in the same neighbourhoods, they mocked the same enemies, and eventually, the 2 groups collided. Exactly how the feud began is still unclear. In many gang conflicts, the original spark becomes lost over time, buried under layers of retaliation, insults, and escalating violence. But by the time 2023 arrived, one thing was certain. 9 Boys and Armed Response were locked in what prosecutors would later describe in court as an ongoing street war. And in a war like that, even a funeral could become a battlefield. What made the attack on that February evening even more disturbing was the fact that the funeral gathering had nothing to do with gang warfare. The boy everyone had come to mourn was named Akeem Bailey. On October 30th, 2022, Akeem left home to meet someone in the Ladywood area of Birmingham. It was a normal Sunday afternoon, the kind that should have passed without incident. But later that evening, emergency services were called to Springfield Street after reports of a young man suffering from serious injuries. When officers arrived, they found Akeem with a devastating stab wound to the neck. Paramedics rushed him to hospital, where doctors fought to save his life. He was placed into an induced coma, but the injury was catastrophic. From the moment he arrived at the hospital, medical staff already knew the truth. His injuries were not survivable. 5 days later, on November 4th, 2022, Akeem Bailey died. He was only 17 years old. Police quickly launched a murder investigation, and soon an 18-year-old named Zechariah Nelson was arrested and charged. When the case later went to court, the details that emerged were both tragic and frustratingly familiar. The meeting between the 2 teenagers had reportedly begun as a dispute over a mobile phone. A small argument, a moment of anger, and in that moment, Nelson had brought a knife. The confrontation escalated, and within seconds, Akeem was lying on the ground with a fatal wound, while Nelson fled the scene. When the trial concluded, Nelson was convicted of manslaughter and wounding rather than murder. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 11 years. But the legal outcome didn't change the most important fact. Akeem Bailey had never been involved in gang activity. He wasn't part of Armed Response. He wasn't part of 9 Boys. He wasn't a rival, an enemy, or a participant in the violence that had been spreading through Birmingham's streets. He was simply a teenager who got caught in a moment that turned deadly. The judge later emphasized this point strongly during the trial connected to the funeral shooting. Akeem, he said, was a completely innocent victim. But there was one detail that complicated things. Akeem had a brother, and his brother had connections to Armed Response. In the world of gang rivalries, that single fact was enough to create danger around everything connected to Akeem, even his funeral. Nearly 4 months after his death, Akeem's family arranged a wake so friends and relatives could finally gather together to remember him properly. They chose St Mary's Church Hall on Hampstead Road in Handsworth. It was meant to be a peaceful evening. People arrived dressed in dark clothing. Some carried flowers. Others shared stories about Akeem and the memories they had with him. Many of the people there had known him since childhood. Around 100 mourners filled the hall. Some of them had connections to armed response. Many of them did not. But all of them had come for the same reason: to say goodbye to a boy whose life had ended far too early. What they couldn't have known was that somewhere else in the city, a man had already decided to turn that gathering into something else entirely. That man was Meshach Bryman. Bryman grew up only a short distance from where the wake was being held. His home was on Chain Walk in Los Ells, an area deeply intertwined with the same street culture that had fueled Birmingham's gang conflicts for decades. His childhood, according to his defense lawyer, was marked by instability and deprivation. He struggled in school and was eventually removed from mainstream education. Instead of attending a regular secondary school, he was placed into a pupil referral unit, a system meant to help students who had been excluded from traditional classrooms. But in many cases, these units fail to provide the support they promise. Rather than offering stability, they often isolate students even further from positive influences. Many young people who pass through them end up surrounded by others who are already drifting toward crime. Bryman's path followed that pattern. As a teenager, he became involved in drug dealing, operating in the same neighborhoods where gangs had long controlled the trade. By 2021, his activities had already brought him before the courts. That year, he was sentenced at Worcester Crown Court for drug supply offences. Instead of immediate prison time, the judge handed him a 2-year suspended sentence. It was an opportunity. If he stayed out of trouble during that period, the conviction would not lead to prison. But that chance didn't change the direction his life was already heading. By the time the suspended sentence expired, Bryman was still deeply involved in the drug trade. When police later searched his home during the investigation into the shooting, they discovered just how extensive his operation had become. Inside the property, officers found crack cocaine, heroin, and cannabis worth thousands of pounds on the street. They also discovered digital scales, equipment used to weigh and package drugs for sale. Nearby were weapons, a machete and a knuckle duster. And then there was his mobile phone. The messages inside it laid out his business clearly. Conversations about packaging drugs, supplying dealers, and controlling younger runners who distributed the product across the city. This wasn't a small-time operation. Bryman had built a system around it. Investigators also uncovered another piece of evidence that reflected the culture he was immersed in. Online, drill music videos had been posted featuring Bryman himself. In the clips, he appeared alongside others, performing lyrics that openly threatened rival gangs. Some of the threats were extremely explicit. In the world of drill music, these kinds of statements are often meant to build reputation and intimidation. But in a courtroom, they carry a very different meaning. They become evidence. And on February 24, 2023, Bryman would move beyond the world of lyrics and videos. That evening, he would act on those threats in real life. By the afternoon of February 24, 2023, the plan was already in motion. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. Investigators would later show that what happened outside St. Mary's Church Hall had been carefully prepared. Bryman had learned that members of armed response would likely attend Akeem Bailey's wake. In the middle of a gang feud, that information wasn't just gossip, it was a target. Earlier that day, Bryman left his home on Chain Walk and walked to a nearby street called Summercroft, where a stolen Nissan Qashqai had been waiting. The vehicle had already been fitted with false number plates, a simple but effective way to confuse the network of ANPR cameras that track cars across Birmingham's roads. Before getting into the car, Bryman took several deliberate steps to avoid being traced later. First, he handed his mobile phone to another gang member. Without a phone, there would be no location data connecting him to the area when the shooting happened. No signals bouncing off nearby towers, no digital trail. Next, he removed his jacket and left it behind. That meant no fibers, no forensic traces linking him to the inside of the stolen car. Then he pulled on a pair of gloves. It was methodical, calculated. Every step suggested someone who understood exactly how investigations worked and how to avoid leaving evidence behind. As evening approached, the Nissan began moving through Birmingham streets toward Handsworth. Inside St. Mary's Church Hall, the wake for Akeem Bailey was underway. Friends, family members and neighbours filled the space, sharing memories and offering support to each other in the difficult hours that follow a funeral. Outside, the Nissan turned onto Hampstead Road shortly after 6 p.m. CCTV cameras captured the car making a slow pass along the road. Then it turned around. Moments later, it came back. From the rear passenger seat, Meshach Bryman leaned out with a 9mm pistol and fired 4 shots directly into the crowd gathered outside the church hall. 4 bullets into a group of around 100 people. What happened next was instant chaos. People screamed and scattered in every direction. Some ran through the doors back into the hall. Others dove behind parked cars or sprinted down the street trying to escape the gunfire. The judge, who would later sentence Bryman, described the scene with 2 words: utter terror. And he wasn't exaggerating. 3 young men were hit. One 19-year-old, believed to have connections to armed response, was shot in the chest, the bullet tearing through his arm before entering his body. The impact broke ribs and damaged his lung. Surgeons later had to remove the bullet during emergency surgery. Another 19-year-old was shot in the foot. An 18-year-old, who had no connection to any gang, was struck in the shin. His injury left him unable to walk properly for months. In court, he explained that the experience had completely changed how he lived his life. "I don't like leaving the house anymore," he said in his victim statement. "I was at my best friend's funeral and got shot. Anywhere you go, something bad can happen." Amid the panic, a 14-year-old girl was knocked to the ground in the stampede as people tried to flee. She was trampled by the crowd and later diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. She hadn't been shot, but the trauma followed her long after that night. Meanwhile, the Nissan Qashqai accelerated away from the scene and disappeared into the streets. The following day, police found the abandoned vehicle about 2 miles away. But by then, the investigation was already moving forward. CCTV footage clearly showed the car and the moment the shots were fired. Detectives began piecing together the evidence, analysing vehicle movements, examining forensic traces, and reviewing cell site data. One key piece of evidence came from the gloves Bryman had worn. Tests revealed gunshot residue consistent with the discharge of a 9mm pistol, the same type of weapon used during the attack. Less than 4 weeks later, on March 21, 2023, officers raided Bryman's home. Inside, they found drugs, weapons, and the phone messages detailing his drug operation. If you found this case powerful or thought-provoking, like the video, share it, and subscribe to Crime Pulse so you never miss the stories that matter.